always liked traveling by train when I can. And if you walk around Grey County, there's lots of places where you can see the old sites of tracks and know that we have a railway heritage. But it's not something that a lot of people get to experience anymore. And to get some perspective on what it was like, I'm going to be sitting down today with Mr. Jim Gowan. Jim, welcome to the program.
Hi.
How are you today?
I'm good.
All right. So as I say, was very keen on rail travel where I can get it, and unfortunately, you can't get it around here anymore. But your family has a strong connection with the railway. Tell us a bit about that.
Yes. Well, my father was born in this area, and during the war, he was an engineer for the CNR, and so he traveled the rails and traveled back and forth from Owen Sound to London via Stratford, and that was where the CNR route went in those years. And by the early 50s, because rail passenger travel was dying and rail freight travel was also slackening off because of the advent of the transport truck, rail traffic was dying here. And between the mid-50s and mid-60s, it died completely with passenger travel going first.
I see. And were you, when you were in, your family was based in London to start with then?
No, we were based here, and my parents had to move. My dad had to move to London to get steady work because there were fewer trains. So in order to get steady work to feed his family, we all had to move to London. And at that point, I was about 6 years old when we moved to London.
Mm-hmm. And what was the scope of railway? Because it's sort of it's something you have to find in very specific spots nowadays. But like, what was its role? How big was it? Where did it go out of Owen Sound?
Well, out of Owen Sound there was the CNR with the terminal on the west shore, and the CNR their terminal was on the east shore, and both tracks left Owen Sound and went north and circled out to east and west so they could get to higher ground before they could head south. Okay. And went into their various terminals and spread out and access to the rest of the country by that means.
So Owen Sound was a hub for railway then?
In the early days, yes. Early days, yes.
Okay. And so your father was a railwayman. What precisely was his role?
He was an engineer.
Mm-hmm. And expand, for those who don't know, expand a little on what the job entails.
Well, back then there would be an engineer, and the second man in the cab would be the fireman, and the third man was the conductor. And the conductor on the passenger train would be the guy that took your tickets, made sure you'd paid to get on the train. Right. On a freight train, he would be the guy that sat at the back of the freight train in the caboose. Oh, okay. And his job was to monitor and keep an eye on the train looking forward to make sure there was no problems that you could see, any hot boxes where there was grease starting to burn or a problem with the train from that perspective.
I see. And speaking of which, traveling on these trains, I understand as a kid you had a rather unique opportunity for an adventure in that vein.
Well, more than one.
Okay.
There were a few occasions when I was very young that my father decided he would take me on a trip with him to go from Owen Sound to London. So he would sneak me onto the train in the middle of the night, and I'd be up in the cab. And with a steam engine, it was quite an event because back then a steam engine was really a big boiler, like a pot-bellied stove. But it was contained, and so that insofar as the fire was to generate steam, and the steam was used to drive the pistons, which were connected to the drive wheels. So that was its propulsion. And behind the engine, directly behind, was a tender, and in that tender was wood, and the wood had to be fed manually or coal. Okay. Way back it was wood, but in the 50s and 60s it was the end of the rail era, and it was progressed to being coal rather than wood. So the coal had to be shoveled into the boiler, so it could generate the heat. And there were gauges there in the compartment, the engineer's compartment, that had to be used to control and monitor the temperatures to make sure that the boiler was operating at the right temperature to run the engine. So one of the trips I remember, I was asked to shovel coal and lift the shovel coal from the tender back here and into the boiler. And I was told I could stop shoveling when that gauge up there got to a certain point. Well, at that point, I could barely lift a shovel. So there wasn't a lot of coal on each shovelful that I put into the boiler. So it took a while for me to move the gauge. But it was just something I'll never forget. And I'm just blessed that I can remember it now.
And was it a freight or a passenger run if it was late at
I
night?
believe it was a freight run.
Okay.
None of the passenger services normally ran at night from here. But on that same trip, I remember stopping at Palmerston in the middle of the night, and the station was open. There was people in there, and there was, sandwiches and pop to get. And I remember asking my father if I could go and get a sandwich and a pop. So he gave me some change and told me to get off on the side of the engine that was away from the terminal. And the reason for that was that he could be severely reprimanded if I was ever seen or caught on that engine, because it was against the rules.
Oh my.
So I got a chance to, be covert and try and sneak into the station to get a sandwich and a pop and come back. And understand that I was really short, still I'm short, but I was really short then, and these steps to climb up into the engine were almost up to my chest.
Oh my goodness.
Because I'm just 6 or 7 years old,
Yeah.
So it presented quite an obstacle, but I made it. And but it was just some of the unique memories. And in my younger years, when I was maybe 2.5, 3, 3.5, somewhere in there, I remember my mother driving my dad down to the train station to leave on a trip. And she would drive, and I'd stand up in the seat beside her with my arm around her neck. That's how big it was. And she'd drop off dead, and then I'd sit in the seat and come back home. There's no seat belts back then, no baby seats. So I can remember doing that many times.
Grand adventure.
Yes, it
We're
was.
going to take a quick break and talk a bit more about the changes.
Okay.
Jim, this fine adventure you had as a kid. Now you mentioned that this was a steam engine.
Yes.
And by the way, thank you. You explained how the mechanics of it excellently. Now, of course, any train that you see nowadays, and it sounds like a lot of increasingly the trains at the time are diesel.
Yes.
What drove that transition?
Cost.
Aha.
cost and efficiency. And the technology was such that steam engines had their limitation, and in our previous discussion I explained to you that steam engines made all of their power at their higher level, the revolutions, the RPM.
Like you have to get them really, really hot.
They have to get them rolling.
Yeah.
So in a mountainous or hilly country, you had to have some long freight train would have to have 3 or 4 steam engines just to get them moving.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
An object in motion tends to stay in motion, but you have to get it there first. So you have to have the power, the torque, to move it. Just like our cars have low gear, mid gear, and high gear. The multiplication of gearing at that low end is required to just get it moving. Well, there was no gearbox on a train, and there isn't now with a diesel. With a diesel, you have a diesel engine, a huge engine. It might fit in this room and have huge amount of torque because of the design of the diesel. That diesel would be connected to a generator. That generator would create electricity. An electric motor can be wound in such a fashion to generate tremendous torque at low RPMs. So you couple the two, the diesel with high torque, and running a generator, which then goes to a diesel motor wound to run and create enormous amounts of torque at lower RPMs and a lot less at higher RPMs. Because once you've got a huge train going at 60 or 70 miles an hour, it doesn't take a lot of energy to keep it going, relatively speaking.
Gotcha. Okay.
So it was perfectly suited to the needs at hand. So that and the diesel required a lot less maintenance. Okay.
Okay. Well, that's the sheer physics of it.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And it's a pity because, of course, I think I remember reading a book by Michael Palin. It was talking about said one of the great things about watching a steam engine is you can see it working.
Yes.
They get compared to living things all
yes.
the time. There was a particular train you were telling me about that people should look up. It's the 64, one of the CNR trains.
Yes.
6403.
After we'd moved to London, I was probably 8 or 9 years old, maybe 10. My dad woke me up in the middle of the night, about 2 o'clock in the morning, said he had a run, asked me if I wanted to go. And it was a weekend, so I wasn't in school. I'm on. So I got up and dressed right away, and he took me down, and we got on this train that was already sitting there ready to go. And it was a beautiful, big, sleek 6400, and my recollection was that it was 6403. And this thing was just amazing. It was humongous. It was just huge. I think there was about 5 drive wheels on each side.
Oh my goodness. Okay.
Which meant that it was a large, powerful single engine.
Right.
And its run was from London to Windsor. And again, I'm sitting in there. We've got the engineer, the fireman, and I'm sitting in the conductor's seat. But it was a passenger train, so he was back looking after passengers back in the cars.
Sure.
So it was a little different than the shovel with the coal, because the coal ran on a conveyor underneath the deck.
Ooh, state of the art.
So yes, exactly. So all he had to do was just turn a switch, and the conveyor came up from under the coal and brought it underneath the floor and went into the boiler. So a lot less labor intensive.
Sure.
And so the fireman switched seats with me, and he said, I got a job for you. And he said, okay, this needle has to be kept between there, and you have to do it by just adjusting these 2 knobs. So he told me how to do it, and he showed me. So I sat there for about half an hour, and I kept moving these knobs, which was operating the conveyor and monitoring the temperature of the steam. So I did that for about half an hour, and apparently, after I fell asleep, and I always slept good on a train, I eventually fell asleep, and the fireman said he'd make a good conductor. So, and the conductor wasn't there to defend himself, but that was his observation.
Oh my goodness.
And when we got to Windsor, we went into the bunkhouse and got some sleep. And later in the morning, somewhere around noon, the trip back to London from Windsor was on a diesel, and I was just so disappointed because the experience, like from a sensory perception point of view, was just a non-starter compared to a steam engine.
Sure. And the 6400s have a pretty special connection in Canadian history, I understand.
Yeah, they do. The 6400 series was what the Queen and King of England traveled across Canada, being pulled by one of them. I believe it was in 1938 or 39, but it was a cross-country tour that the King and Queen took.
Royal connection.
And that was the engine that was used to lead their train,
Very
to
nice.
pull their train, yeah.
Well, it sounds like an engine fit for a king. Or a
Yes,
queen.
it was. It was amazing to look at.
Very excellent. So yeah, no, it's they almost seem alive, don't they?
Yes.
The way they
Well,
huff and puff.
when a steam engine starts up, because of the power situation I explained earlier, when they start, there's a huge amount of, huff and bluster that doesn't go anywhere, but there's a lot of noise and steam and soot.
Right.
And in the early days, the cabins weren't really sealed. You've got soot and everything flowing in your face and smoke. And when it starts to move, all the couplers, all the slack gets taken up, and there's a huge clunk as each car in turn connects and the slack is taken up. And then it just huffs and puffs and it just works its guts out just to get started.
A lot of energy.
Yeah, and the sound and the noise and, just an amazing experience.
We're going to talk about the experience a little more when we come back. We're back. So Jim, your father being an engineer on the railroad, what was his experience? What was his work day like?
Well, it was a very stressful job. The demands and the responsibility was enormous. I mean, you either have multi-millions of dollars worth of product that the customers and the shippers are relying on him to get there on time, or you have 10, 15, 20 carloads of people that are relying on him and the crew to get them to the destination safely and on time and without spilling their soup in the dining car. So it was a great responsibility, and part of the problem is you have all this stress, and physically, it's kind of sedentary because he's just sitting there. There's no exercise. You can't stand up because whether it's a steam engine or a diesel, there's a dead man switch that he has to keep his foot on, okay? And if he stands up, everything stops right now.
Right.
Okay, so you know, he has to keep it going, he has to control it, he has to manipulate it. And especially in situations where there's an accident, where he's operating a train that's working a crane or a hook to kind of bring cars back onto the tracks, he has to be able to move that thing sometimes a quarter inch at a time.
Just to get the wheels
just to get the crane or whatever devices they're using to fix a problem. He has to move it precisely. And I mean, literally, when you're in a station or pulling into a station or pulling out of a station, people are sitting there having a meal. That soup can't smell. So the application of power, whether steam engine or diesel, has to be applied so smoothly as to be not even noticeable.
What strikes me is because when I'm visualizing, I've seen them, I see them in movies all the time of the steam engine, sort of cabin with the tender right behind it. It doesn't look like the engineer can get out. Is there a way for him to? Does he get in a long trip? Do you have like switching off of shifts, or does he?
You're pretty well there. I mean, the duration of his trips, unless it's on one of these wrecks, the duration of his trip might be 4 or 5 hours. And the train might stop on occasion, a freight train stopping, dropping off cars and picking up cars along the way.
Okay.
Passenger train normally stops at various stops to pick up people. So there's an opportunity for him to stand up and move around a little bit, depending on the length of the stop or the number of cars. Firemen were also, in a way, trainees to become engineers. So there were opportunities to have training sessions as well, but pretty well he's there.
Does I'm thinking especially the engineer, but the fireman too. Did the steam engine? Did people working on the steam engines, was their health impacted by all the smoke and the dust and so on?
That's something I can't answer. But I mean, we look at our regulations today just on secondhand cigarette smoke. I mean, I'm sure that it would have some kind of impact. And you look at coal miners that are exposed to coal dust. So there's coal, there's burning ash. Yep. It makes sense that it would impact some people negatively.
And of course, the main thing that I can imagine must loom over engineers today as well is the possibility of a bad accident.
Yes.
Were they common in your recollection?
Yes. I mean, we look at the recent accident in Quebec, the tragedy there. And, I was kind of shocked. I hadn't really kept up on things. But I was really shocked to find out there was only one person running that train. No conductor, no fireman, just one person carrying hazardous materials. That to me is shocking and disgraceful. It really is.
And you're talking about the crane operating, and that would be cleaning up an accident on some occasions. That must be a bit harrowing.
Yes. And even worse if you've been involved in an accident.
Well, and I think you told me that your father was in a accident, which mercifully wasn't terribly serious, but was certainly memorable.
Yes, Shallow Lake.
Tell us all about it.
Okay. He left Owen Sound, I believe it was a Saturday. I'm not sure, but I believe it was a Saturday. And they chugged their way up the hill, up the side of the hill, up past 28th Street and up towards the north, and then the 6 or 7 kilometers over towards Shallow Lake.
Freight or passenger on this one?
I can't remember, but I think it was a freight.
Okay.
But when you get over towards Shallow Lake, that's where the CNR made a curve and headed back south and headed towards Palmerston and then down through towards Stratford on its way to London. When they came around the turn towards Shallow Lake, there was a truck stuck on the crossing. It was winter time and there had been snow and ice the night before. So the rear wheels of the truck at the crossing, apparently it slipped off the edge of the road, and the rear wheels on one side were stuck down between the tracks. So he's trying desperately to move the truck back and forth and get out from under there, and nothing was happening. There's a truck and there's a tanker that's pulling. So they blow the whistle and apply the brakes on full. By this time, they're going full steam. They're wound up. And they know they have no chance whatsoever of stopping. The rules, safety rules, allowed them the opportunity to choose between jumping and riding it out. Now jumping, you might think, well, that's the easy one, but it really isn't, because they knew and had heard of many people who jumped from trains traveling a lot less than 45 or 50 miles an hour that hit the ground and rolled under the wheels. They were either, injured badly, disabled, or killed. So that wasn't an obvious better choice.
Okay. But on the other hand,
there's a tanker sitting there. There's no lettering on the side. It didn't say Esso. It didn't say Sunoco. It's just a tanker car, trailer. They looked at each other, made a brief decision to ride it out. So they hit the truck right between the cab and the trailer, split them apart, destroyed both of them completely, and came to a stop a long way down. And when everything stopped turning, we're dealing with a huge fire and boiler here on wheels.
Yep.
And this thing is just sizzling, and they had to laugh. They started laughing because what they were covered with was buttermilk.
Surprise.
So, I mean, had it been gasoline, probably Shallow Lake wouldn't exist today. So,
yes.
So it was kind of a tense moment that, everybody was so grateful that there was nobody killed. The driver jumped out of the truck and got away. But the bad news for the truck driver was that truck and trailer was less than a day old.
Oh my God.
It had just been put in service the day prior.
Oh,
So it was brand new pride and joy. It was on its first commercial trip, and it was trash.
Well, and railway working clearly and never a dull moment.
Yes.
All right. Well, and it's an extraordinary story. Hopefully, we can people will be able to check out more about it at the Marine and Rail Museum or the Railway Museum down in Toronto. But these stories are absolutely remarkable, and it sounds like it was a fine adventure all around.
Yes.
All right, Jim. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll wish you well.
Thank you.
Very much.